Hello and welcome to Full Disclosure, a podcast project designed entirely to let me spend more time than I'd ever get on the radio with interesting people. Although, given that today's guest and I work in the same building and cross paths at least several times a day, we probably could have carved out an hour somewhere else, Jon Sopel.
Down a pub.
Down a pub, perhaps, yes. But then other people wouldn't be able to join us through the medium of podcast, which has been a game changer for you, the medium of podcast.
It's been a liberation. It's been exciting. It has been risky in the sense that, you know, you leave a safely cosseted, pensioned job at the BBC. And, you know, you must have found this when you start from zero when you launch a podcast. There are no listeners. And so Emily Maitlis said to me, I've got an idea. And I was on a plane to Australia at the time. And I thought, that's a pretty good idea. Why don't we do it? Came to Global and, you know, it's been a joy to see something grow, which I kind of believed had the potential of doing, and particularly getting a very different audience demography wise than I was reaching when I was the BBC's North America editor in Washington.
And it continues, of course, to go from strength to strength, as no doubt will your new book Strangeland, which addresses the question of how Britain stopped making sense. But we will begin at the beginning, which is in 1959. I was struck by the news to me, not to you, obviously, that you spent the first 11 years of your life in the Oxford and St George's Club in Whitechapel.
Yeah, in Stepney. Yeah. So it was, obviously, when you are surrounded by a certain type of upbringing, you don't think it's normal.
No,
you don't think it's anything other than, you don't think it's abnormal because it's just the surroundings that you're in.
It's the only childhood you'll ever know.
And it's the only childhood I knew. But the Oxford and St George's Club had been set up years earlier when there was the huge influx of Jews from Eastern Europe, and the very well established wealthy Jews who were Sephardic from Southern Europe and North Africa were suddenly terrified that the lifestyle that they enjoyed, the Sassoons, the Montagues, the Henricus families, these very wealthy, well established families, the Disraelis, was going to be upset by an influx of kind of ill-educated, smelly, Yiddish-speaking East European Jews escaping the pogroms of Russia and Poland at the time. And so the club was set up, this settlement, and it was a huge building with, you know, there were gymnasiums, there was a ballet rink, there was a great hall where the big events would be put on the roof, there was five-a-side football, there was a squash court, there was a boxing rink. And this is all I grew up with around it because we lived there. We lived on one little corridor, my sister and my parents ran this place. And it mixed a kindergarten, Darby and Joan, youth clubs. There were students from America who'd come and help. And it was and the name, the Oxford and St George's, which could not be more quintessentially English, was about getting these East Europeans who had come to the country and turning them into English men and women to know that their first loyalty was to Britain. And, you know, and there was an honours board in the club of those who lost their lives in, you know, 39 to 45 in the Second World War.
How did Mum and Dad, Miriam and Maya, end up in that role? Do you know?
Yeah, so my dad was the youngest of 9 children, East End Jew, grew up in Wapping, talked to me about the Battle of Cable Street, keeping the brown shirts out, keeping
He was there?
Yeah, because that's where he lived. That was home. And there was suddenly going to be this influx of... and so my dad was... and had been a member of the club from very early days when it had first started. The Oxford and St George's started in 1914. My mother had a very different background, without going into too much family history. But my mother was the illegitimate child from an affair that my grandmother had had in Darlington and was banished. My grandmother was quite entrepreneurial and had kind of bought various properties around the place and was kind of generating quite an income from those properties. And my mother went to the London School of Economics at the end of the war and studied there, and then kind of had, you know, an ambition to be a social worker, and found herself in the East End, where she met my dad, who was 17 years older, who'd never been married. I mean, he had a twin sister, and I think he was very close to his twin sister, and had never married. And so they got wed when, and there was a big age difference. So my dad was in his mid-40s when he got married.
That's a remarkable backstory.
Yeah.
Isn't it? So we've established that most of us don't know that there's anything different about our childhoods in the context of environment and where we are. But were you aware? I mean, there must have still been some shame, perhaps, attached to your mum's legitimacy.
And
age gaps were less rare, perhaps, then. I don't know.
Yeah, all those things were very real,
right,
at that stage. And so you kind of, and I suppose I was conscious that my dad was from a slightly different background, a much more East End background than my mum, but they were sort of pillars of the East End community because they ran this big youth centre. My father was the governor of a number of schools and my mother was a magistrate and all the rest of it. But then we moved from this upbringing of it sounds very hippy dippy to say it was a communal upbringing. It wasn't. There were very strict rules. But everyone ate together in the kind of common room or whatever. These students who lived in as well, and then ran this whole centre, which was operating sort of pretty much, almost 24/7. And then at aged 11, I think my mother got sick and tired of having no privacy because you were on public display the whole time. Then we moved to a 3-bedroom semi-detached house in Finchley, and it just could not. And I found that the big culture shock.
It would be. So you go from abnormal to normal.
Well, I went from a place where no one owned their own house because everyone was living in public housing, either provided by the council or housing trusts or whatever, to Finchley Central, where pretty much everyone's a kind of owner-occupier.
So they had a shared interest in public service, mum and dad.
Yeah, they did, very much so. They very much did so, and my mother carried on having worked in this. In the Oxford and St George's, which was ostensibly for the Jewish immigrant community, she went and became the director of a Church of England charity.
Gosh.
So they were
for an equal opportunities.
Yeah. So it wasn't. So it was a very mixed kind of picture.
You went to school while you were still in Stepney. You went to
Harry Gosling
school. What was that like?
Harry Gosling's primary school. It was the school it was literally across the road.
So were you like a form of sort of local celebrity then? Would the Sopels be known to everybody, even as you?
A bit. Tiny bit. But the Sopels were known, and my parents knew the headmistress of the school, and there was kind of, and my sister was much, much cleverer than me, so she was kind of, the headmistress apparently told my mum that your daughter's, we can't really serve, so she ought to go to a school, and she got a full scholarship to go to the City of London School for Girls. I was not that bright. I got into grammar school, and aged 11 moved to grammar school. I remember first day in grammar school, and
this is in Finchley now. This is
in
at Christ College.
Christ College, Finchley. And Mrs. Wilkins was the form teacher, and I go in late because I've moved from Tower Hamlets to Barnet. And Mrs. Wilkins said, "What's your name?" And I go, "Jonathan." She said, "No, your surname." And I said, "Sopel." She said, "Sopel, go and sit down over there." And suddenly that kind of wrenching difference from the sort of warmth of a small primary school to the sort of old-fashioned grammar school that had pretensions of being a minor public school.
Yes.
With a combined cadet corps and fives courts and stuff like that, but still a state school, was really marked.
And were you a good student? You're comparing yourself to your sister, but you weren't at the same school. So did you flourish?
No, I didn't. I was really slow. I was rebellious.
How much pressure was there from home? Was mum pushy? Did she want?
Yeah, the old joke about the difference between a Catholic mum and a Jewish mum is that the Catholic mum says, if you fail your exams, I'll kill you, and the Jewish mother says, if you fail your exams, I'll kill myself. And I think there's an element of that going on. But you've got to succeed. You've got to do well, and do you really want to be stocking shelves in Tesco's for as your future? And so I think that there was slight exasperation that my sister seemed to breeze through, and I was always in scrapes. Literally, I kind of had my first motorcycle accident when I was 16, and sort of in plaster for sort of 5 or 6 months because I had a very bad break of my leg, and they're kind of, oh God, what's he going to do next? What's he going to do now?
What were you good at? What did you like at school?
I sort of loved history, economics. It's the stuff that I'm now sort of doing, really. Yes. English, history, politics, economics. Those are the sort of things that were interested me. And I remember aged 16 hanging out with a crowd in North London, based around Hampstead. And my first girlfriend, and we're still very close friends, her dad was a cabinet minister in the Callaghan government, and kind of suddenly becoming an awareness of politics, suddenly, just through seeing what happened in her home in Kentish Town.
Gosh.
Was really interesting. And it was also the sort of politics that who should we have to our party? Oh, do we have to have them? Well, they might be useful to us in the...
You'd witness all these
You witnessed that and you thought, wow. I kind of had these high-minded ideals. It was about, he was a very right-wing Labour. He was one of the Gang of Four he was Bill Rogers.
Yeah,
who's
I've
still
worked
alive.
that out, actually. I thought you were being coy.
No. Right, you'd got there before me, as always, James.
No, shush.
And he, so he went off to form the Gang of Four, and it was just a really interesting time. And I kind of thought politics was about ideas of equality and levelling up and society, and then you saw the reality of three-line whips and doing deals and some of that, and I found that fascinating. I mean, I found it absolutely fascinating about and kind of what we're still trying to do on the podcast is slightly lift the curtain a bit on how political decisions are made, because I don't think people fully get that.
So mum and dad had been involved in, if you're talking about pulling strings, their strings were very short. They wanted to have a direct impact upon people they could see in front of them, whether you're the governor of the school or a social worker, or whether you're running at the Oxford and St George's Club. But exposure to this family showed you the much longer strings of power, that you can be miles away from the people you directly affect. Completely.
And that was, it was intoxicating, and it was slightly... So, I found it kind of a strange world. I thought I would end up in social work and, doing stuff that my parents had done and, wanted to do. And that they, it was about helping the local community and giving back and, kind of doing your bit to, because there were a lot of people we saw who had lives that were very, very tough. And, and sometimes it was brought upon by their own kind of errors, but sometimes it was structural. And so I had a sense of all of that. But then you see politics being played out on a bigger stage, and, and I've always, and I suppose it did inform my politics now, which is that, it's all very well being ideologically pure, but you've got to have power to make some changes. And that invariably requires you to be someone who's prepared to make deals and to kind of, to get along, to make things a bit better.
And would you join the conversation around the dinner table at the Rogers family?
Yeah, I would try to insofar. But, I mean, in fairness to Bill, who is a lovely guy, he gets home, he's had politics. Just please tell me about what you've done at school today, rather than about whether I've fallen out with Roy Hattersley over this or that.
What's Barbara Castle really like?
Exactly.
What were conversations around the dinner table at home then about?
They were also sort of political and current affairs. I mean, I remember we would always have the Home Service, the Radio 4 and the Today programme. And I remember kind of excruciating, age 12. There was something on the, it was Brian Redhead and John Timpson or whoever it was presenting the Today programme. And there was something, suddenly a conversation about VD. And I said to my mother, what is VD? And I really wished I hadn't asked. I just wanted to get on my bicycle and cycle to school, which is what I used to do. And instead of which I was given a lecture about the birds and the bees and venereal disease. And the worst thing you could do is get a girl pregnant. And I'm thinking, stop, Mum, please just stop now. The toes are curling inside my shoes right now. Can you please stop?
So journalism was a present then. It wasn't. I mean, it was a background noise in the house.
It was a background noise, and I didn't have any contact. There was no, kind of when people have dared to say that I am part of the elite of, you knew everybody. I didn't know a soul. I didn't know a soul who was a journalist. And I went to university. I wasn't that sure what I wanted to do, and 1982, I was the president of the Students' Union at Southampton University, and a friend who'd graduated, still a very great friend, and had gone to journalism college, and he was doing a work placement at Radio Victory in Portsmouth as they're loading up the ships to sail to the South Atlantic at the start of the Falklands War. And they're loading up the armaments and they're emptying the supermarkets of all the fresh produce because they need to go on the ships before they sail the 8,000 miles down to the South Atlantic. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating to see what he was doing. I thought, oh, God, that's a good job.
And look at what you've just identified as the fascinating bits, the sort of the quotidian of it, the loading up the ships, the emptying the supermarkets, not necessarily not just the big international diplomacy issues, but the impact upon ordinary real people who aren't
and then
in headlines.
Yes, exactly. And I still love talking. I mean, I think there are those people who are inherently on transmit as human beings. And people think that broadcasting is about being able to transmit. Have you got a clear voice? Can you articulate a story? Can you manage people's expectations and keep them engaged? And yet, actually, hopefully, what you and me are quite good at as well is listening. And I love hearing people's stories. Now, as I've got older, I've become more interested in the process and what the wider picture is and what the wider ramifications are of power, as you have as well. And I think that's a sort of, but it all starts with individuals and their stories and being able to listen to them
and wanting to understand things.
Yeah,
that's not just the pleasure of the narrative, not just being an audience member listening to a great story, using the stories to try and assemble a better understanding of the world.
Exactly. And I think that is journalism at its best, that it's not just an abstract discussion where people are removed from the equation. Politicians make decisions that affect people's lives, and they need to be conscious of what that impact has. And as soon as you become divorced from that, that's when politicians fall apart. Thatcher, thinking she could walk on water, introduced the poll tax, and sure enough, this kind of formidable Iron Lady is brought down by it because it was so tin-eared about what people would think about it. Yes.
Let's jump ahead very briefly and remember the time she called you an inattentive schoolboy.
Did she really say that? I remember being in Downing Street, and I think it was when Mandela had been released from prison. And it was kind of all the good and the great, John Cole from the BBC, Jon Snow, Michael Brunson from ITV, Eleanor Goodman, Channel 4, all these sort of names of, when I went into reporting on politics, were just kind of these huge figures. And I'd had my hand up to ask a question in this Downing Street, it was in the street that she came out and spoke. And I've kind of drifted off because someone's asked my question. And she said, you had a question. And I'm thinking, did I?
Have you put your hand down by this point?
I put my hand down.
This is brutal.
That was brutal. And I just felt this sense of utter humiliation. Of please, could just one of those sort of holes open up in the ground and swallow me, because she was a terrifying figure, and and I remember being in the committee corridor when she failed to win a majority, when she was challenged for the leadership, and it opened up the bigger contest. Yes. When it was Heseltine, Major and Hurd, but she'd fallen too short of the required majority when it was Anthony Mair. So Anthony Mair was the stalking horse candidate.
Were you an inattentive schoolboy? Not then, but at school, because I presume that going to university was something that your mum would not brook any alternative. It was your destiny was probably out, so you had to go, regardless of whether you wanted to or not. You had to do something at university, and of a piece with what you've described so far, you did politics and sociology.
Yeah, and because those were the subjects that engaged me and interested me, and one was about society and individuals and inequality and all the rest of it, and which was more the sociology piece of it, and the politics of it was about the wider sort of political systems. And again, the fusing the two of personal narrative and political impact is something that I kind of sometimes just think I'm an amazingly unimaginative person. But I got into journalism, I found myself a square peg in a square hole, and thought, kind of this is suits what I do. And I still I still feel the same sense of adrenaline when the big story breaks, because you can see the ramifications of it and how big this is going to be. And wow, this is quite something to try and understand, to explain, to engage an audience with.
And possibly also, as you get older, the appeal of digging deeper into the themes after the event, which is very much the purpose of the new book, Strangeland. Also looking at that, bringing a very personal narrative to bear on something, which is quite an un-BBC thing to do, to look at things very much through the lens of your own specific experiences, in the hope of making sense of the bigger picture, notably the Britain you returned to after being North America correspondent, being so confusing or discombobulating. So in a way, this book is much of your career or your life has been a preparation for writing this book. In a way,
and it was the book started off was going to be an autobiography,
right?
And they said, they said, I'd written 3 books that had done all right in recent years when I was in America, and the publisher wanted another book, and it was going to be one of those, a funny thing happened on the way to the studio, which I absolutely frigging hate.
Don't say that, because you don't know what'll be next.
Yeah, I know, it may well be next. No, I say that, but it just. I got really bored of myself,
right?
Writing in the first person so much. And I wanted to write something that was a bit first person, but was dealing with bigger themes and using experience of what I'd witnessed in America.
Yeah.
And then bringing it to bear on what on earth was happening in Britain. And I talk about how, I think the first election I voted in, the 1979 election when Thatcher won after Labour were booted out of power after the winter of discontent, for the next 28 years, nearly 3 decades, I saw 3 prime ministers. I saw Thatcher, I saw Major, and I saw Blair. 1979 to 1997. And I came back from America in 2022 and we had 3 prime ministers in 1 year. And you just thought, what on earth has happened to our country? And it was like someone had set an exam question for the maths GCSE paper and had misprinted the equation that everyone had to work out, and there was no answer. And that felt to me what had happened with Brexit.
Yes.
That people had been set an equation for which there is no answer, and politics was struggling with it, and it came to kind of blow up and explode in 2022 when the ludicrous promises that had been made and had not been realised suddenly became the impossibility of it all. And so you were left with the boosterism, the deceit, then you're trying to massage the way Parliament works and you're proroguing it unlawfully, and it goes on, and it just went on and on and on. And this also the sense that there was impunity for the political leadership, that they could do what they liked. And I just thought, this is really dangerous moment. I thought I would never see anything that would rival the 6th of January 2021. And in 2022 in British politics, you thought, oh my God.
We're flirting with it.
We're flirting with it. And this is dangerous. And of course, you're right, James, in saying that at the BBC, I would not have been able to write this book.
Or say any of that.
Or say any of what
I'll certainly not open the book with a very cutting description of Brexit.
Yeah. And yet I felt that this was something that was profound, and look,
but also obvious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that
to you,
it was obvious to me, and it just felt wow. And I kind of worried about the way we were discussing it and the way we were framing it, and so my love of the BBC is undimmed.
Yes, it is, and your respect and your loyalty to your colleagues as well.
Yeah, who I think do a fantastic job. But I think there are limitations over the language it can find to discuss some of the more domestic political difficulties. If you're Jeremy Bowen or you were Jon Sopel when he was in Washington,
yes,
you can call it pretty much. I think there are much more constraints because of the relationship between government and the BBC, the funding model, the fact that, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, there was a huge amount of bullying that was going on. And so, it's always difficult to measure exactly what the effect of the bullying is. But I sometimes felt that it was, okay, let's not go near that subject. Like Brexit, you don't hear that much about Brexit.
Still. Or the false equivalence, which, of course, Emily has been particularly articulate on the subject of balancing things that don't have any natural balance to them. I mean, you're uniquely placed to talk about this in a way, because I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know that you'd have had this perspective if you hadn't been away. If you'd been in the Goldfish Bowl of Westminster, if you'd still been in the lobby, you'd still been presenting the politics show, I don't know that you would have been able to step back from it in the way that you could as a BBC man.
I think that's absolutely true. And as I say, I absolutely loved the career that I had at the BBC. It was the most privileged job to be able to be the North America editor at a time when, Donald Trump is the president and you are seeing extraordinary things unfolding, and then January the 6th and the impeachments and all the rest of it, that it was amazing. But when you leave the BBC, it was a kind of, it's like the easy metaphor is it's the lifer who is suddenly told by the prison warders that you can leave now. They unlock the door and the prisoner thinks, I can't go outside. This is part of who I am. Yeah. And then you leave and you realise that there were things that were really less than perfect. And why does it have to be like that? And so I did feel that there was stuff that I wanted to write,
yes,
with respect, and I understand the difficulties, but sometimes difficult subjects get ducked because they're just too awkward, or the line of least resistance is taken, or you become risk averse. And actually, I don't know about you. We have had, since launching the podcast, we've tackled some pretty off subjects. We have had zero editorial interference, and I think that is a great place to be.
Yes, and it would once have been true of the BBC.
It was that sort of. It wasn't that you were told you can't do this and you mustn't say that. Although there was occasional times where it would be a line would be set out for you. But it was just I'd just be a little cautious on that, old boy. Yeah. Were you sure? I mean, maybe we could just, this could. And it's just that sort of, by implication, you feel this weight on your shoulder that you shouldn't do something or say something.
And it's worse in a way because it's often, in the case of management, it's actually self-protection that's kicking in there, whereas they should be dedicated to protecting you. So they're worried about the Daily Mail front page or the phone call from Downing Street, and that makes you and colleagues vulnerable to bullying.
So the best editors I worked with were shock absorbers.
Yeah.
They were there as the bumper on the car.
Yeah.
So that when someone in Downing Street or the leader of the opposition crashes into you, they absorb the shock and don't tell you what has gone on.
Because it affects your job. I mean, you go on air with a little bit of a wobble.
Yeah.
Because you're worried or you're trying to second guess what people are going. That's what the editor should be protecting you from.
Yes, and there were some that were brilliant at it, and there were others who thought actually the easiest thing would be if we just don't do this at all, and we let's not talk about that. And there were odd instances where, I mean, do you remember when Boris Johnson? This is an episode of the podcast we were doing. When Boris Johnson had made the comment about Keir Starmer and Jimmy Savile and all the rest of it, and we were told on the podcast that because I said we were doing an American focused podcast, and I said on this that what I really wanted to do was to reverse the lens and say, actually, is British politics becoming more like American politics with this smear and all the rest of it? And they said, yeah, great idea, great topic. We just don't want to run any of that Keir Starmer sound from the Commons. I said, but the Keir Starmer sound, but the sound from the Commons is privileged. I mean, it's Commons debate. It's in Hansard. It's public record. Yeah, let's do it, but we're not going to play the Boris Johnson clip because it may not be true. Well, that's the whole point.
But it isn't true.
It's not true. So that's the whole point of playing it. And there was a sort of line of least resistance.
Well, you're very kind. That's cowardice.
Well, I say that in the book. There are times when people mistook impartiality and replaced it with cowardice because that was easier.
And that's the second element of uniqueness to your perspective in the book, isn't it? That you can knit together the American and the British completely in a way that I don't know anyone else could have done. Certainly not in the context of the BBC, because you had one foot in both countries throughout. There's one very telling moment. I bet you were pleased when you spotted the thing about the hair, weren't you? The Donald Trump never has a hair out of place, and Boris Johnson never has a hair in place. Yeah. It's like two sides of the same coin almost.
And I at first I thought that they're actually quite different. Because
Yeah.
if you look at the education and the way, that Boris Johnson can make classical allusion and all the rest of it, and then you see him in person, and you see him. I saw him at a do at the British Embassy, and he's charming and flattering, and you think, oh, Prime Minister's being very, and he's very good at all of that. And the more time has elapsed, the more I think they are very, very alike. And the need for attention, the sort of degree of narcissism, when the Privileges Committee report came out and Boris Johnson was complaining it's a kangaroo court and a witch hunt and all the rest of it, I thought, oh my God, this is straight out of, Donald Trump could have written this. I mean, it was written slightly better than if Donald Trump had tweeted it, but it was broadly the same.
Fewer capitals.
Yeah, fewer capitals, fewer exclamation marks. But it was the same message.
Yeah.
And that same sense of entitlement of how dare you, the plebs, question me. And I think that our job in journalism is to shine a light on power. And I think we do it fearlessly, whoever is in power. I don't think it's a question of, I always loved it when, I gave Donald Trump at times a very hard time when I was North America editor and I was outside the White House doing lives on the 10 o'clock news. And then Joe Biden becomes the president and he makes some decisions on Afghanistan, which I thought were absolutely catastrophic, having been there kind of when they were fighting the Taliban in 2001 and moving with a front line. And I had strong feelings on it. And I wrote how catastrophic Joe Biden's handling of Afghanistan had been. And so suddenly I'm getting people tweeting me saying, oh, so you've got buyer's remorse now. No, I'm just holding power to account. That's what we do. I don't care. Keir Starmer's got some problems now. He made a big case about stopping Tory sleaze. If you're going to be the spear carrier for that, don't be surprised if it comes back at you because you're accepting free gifts for thousands of pounds over how you and your wife are going to be clothed.
More than anyone else in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
So you're going to...
It's inevitable. And so, that is hypocrisy and therefore it's going to get called out. He may have played it by the rules, but does it pass the smell test? Now, that's our job to do that sort of thing.
Before we back up, just the difference that social media has made, because when you started out, there wouldn't be any way for people to say, oh, buyer's remorse, is it? Unless they'd met you, literally in person, or you could be bothered to go through the BBC log. You would have absolutely no interaction with the audience. And now... probably the polar opposite is true, if you are so minded to look at it. Yeah,
it's the polar opposite. But I also think that with the social media, I think that what Musk has done to X or Twitter is it's horrible now.
There's a book. Have you seen this new book that's coming out? So it's absolutely incredible.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just this week actually.
I haven't seen it. No. I mean, it's turning into a sewer, and you're just wading through shit, day in, day out, and you just think, ugh. And and the amplification of kind of conspiracy theory and nonsense, and I really regret that, and I really worry about democracy if that is the standard of debate. And I think it does, I mean, look, we are doing podcasts benefiting from the new media, which didn't exist before, and different ways of reaching an audience. I think that's all positive. I think that's a good thing for us to be doing. But it's also leading to a proliferation of misinformation and disinformation, and that frightens me about the lifeblood of our democracy. If people are going to polling stations on polling day and picking up a fat stubby pencil and they are marking their cross on the basis of conspiracy theory and bullshit that has been out there. And I think our job is to challenge that as much as possible. Social media has made it very much more difficult. But I also think that social media is not the real world in itself. Just because I think, if you go back to the, Corbyn's election defeat in 2019, and so a lot of Labour people couldn't believe it because his tweets would get so many likes. And you think, well, no, always remember that if 100,000 people have been on a protest about X or Y in central London on a Saturday lunchtime, there were 68 million people, 900,000 who weren't, who were going about their ordinary lives. And I think that we mustn't just listen to those who shout loudest to think that that is where the centre of gravity is.
There was an old story about Michael Foot rejecting opinion polls because every public meeting he held in relatively small town halls was packed to the rafters. So this can't possibly be true. Let's back up a bit to that final year at Southampton. I read that you got a pile of rejection letters when you started applying for jobs at the early 80s. What sort of jobs were you applying for?
I was applying for parliamentary researcher jobs. I was applying straight into journalism jobs.
You were?
Yeah. And I'd had no real journalistic. I'd written for the student newspaper. I hadn't done, I did not have a distinguished CV, and so I went to journalism college, and there was this absolute...
Well, you stood as a sabbatical first,
Yeah, I
didn't you?
did.
You're
I was president of the
student
union. I was president of the student union. I was the sort of... It was quite a conservative university at Southampton.
Was it?
I was seen as the socially acceptable face for the Labour group, because they thought I didn't seem that scary, and I was actually quite right wing as a sort of when I was a Labour student. And then you go into journalism, and I thought, I've got to suspend all membership of political parties, and because I don't want anyone to say you're only saying this because of X.
Well, isn't that interesting that Lewis, of course, the third newsagent, third musketeer, his student involvement in Labour politics was brought back to question his ability to be absurdly brought back, but nonetheless brought back to question his ability to be impartial as a BBC. It's another illustration of how much things have changed over the course of your career.
But I also think that actually people who've been interested in politics will have tended at one stage or other to have a political outlook. And the fact that they understand politics probably makes them much better journalists, because they know to ask the right questions. And I think that Lewis is absolutely brilliant journalist.
Of course he is. Yes.
And I think there are other people who've been sort of political who also make brilliant journalists, because they're very good at asking tough questions. I mean, Nick Robinson, who presents the Today programme, who was very involved in conservative student politics, I think he's bloody brilliant. I don't think he gives an easier ride to Labour than he does to Conservative, and I think that I don't care how he votes. It's does he do a good job when he's doing a political interview, and I think he does.
The difference being, of course, that he's allowed to by the forces that we've touched on earlier, the forces that management are fearful of, or the front pages, or the criticisms. Is no one is going to bring up his student past when suggesting that he's a biased BBC journalist. If he had a left-wing student past, I think they would.
Yeah, I think there is an element of truth in that. I think the BBC...
And that's not Nick's fault.
No.
Categorically.
It's nothing. I think there is a sort of... The BBC often goes into a crouch position and thinks that there is a way of winning over the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph.
Yeah.
And my experience is you're never going to win over the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph. So forget about what they're going to say, because they're going to come after you anyway. Don't do stupid shit, of course not. But there was
there's a
also,
T-shirt.
Yeah, but there was also an element in which, if you were of the right, you had more latitude, because the BBC look, you can't accuse us of being left wing. Look, yes. we've got a token righty here.
Yes.
It was sort of almost like the kind of antediluvian attitudes towards race, where we can't say we're a racist. We've got a black news presenter, without thinking about what it looks like throughout the whole organisation. I think there was an element of that still in the BBC.
So you, off the back of your friend's experiences reporting on the fleet getting ready to set sail at Portsmouth, you don't get a rejection letter, thankfully, from the London College of Printing, which was a very good course, wasn't it? It was a very prestigious course, the broadcast journalism course at the London College of Printing. And from there, back to Southampton.
Radio Solent. And because I was interested in politics, I was sent out to do constituency profiles of all the candidates that were standing in the 1983 election, which was the Thatcher landslide election, and the Tories kind of ran the table in that area. And again, I'm from we've discussed, I'm from this East End London background, and I'd go, so just tell me a little bit about yourself. And they'd say, Eton, the Guards, Cirencester Agricultural College, farmer, and Tory MP. All right, okay. And there were dozens of them, and I just thought, oh my God, I'm living in a different world. And I had, I suppose I felt quite, I remember going to university and thinking, oh, I'm quite urbane and sophisticated because I grew up in London and I saw all of this stuff. And then I met all these, people a bit like that, and I thought, I know nothing about these people. And and still in the House of Commons then it was, Eton, Oxford, the Guards, and it was just wow.
I hadn't picked up on that element of it, that sense of you being on safari almost when you started out as a political journalist.
Yeah, and so I was, because I loved all of that sort of story, and so I did all the political coverage, and I got the job. I left local radio and I got the job in London, and the local radio station, please will you stay on and do the 87 election for us before you go and work as a reporter on The World at 1 p.m. And so I covered the 87 election as the editor. and then went up to work in London.
What do you like off air? I mean, presumably.
What do you mean? What am I
well,
like?
well, I mean, as editor, you would not. Would you send yourself on the biggest stories?
No, editor. I hate.
Well, you wouldn't like that, would you?
No, hated it. Absolutely hated it. And because of also, I'm just temperamentally unsuited to management.
Yes.
I love.
That hasn't stopped lots of other people.
Well, now we could really get going. We could let rip on all the bloody hopeless managers we've had over the years. No,
but you want to be on the front line.
Yeah,
you want to be there.
I wanted to be there. I wanted to be there where the story's happening and you're reporting on it and you're kind of watching the thing unfold, and it's up to you to try and make sense of it.
And how ambitious were you?
I think I was quite ambitious. I mean, yeah, I was. Look, when opportunities came, I seized them. And so, the opportunity came to be in London, and I got rung up, and I was then.
So this is 20. Where are we
now?
now?
We're about 1986.
Okay.
I would think that I'd done a story in the Isle of Wight about a guy who'd got stuck down a well. The story ran for days.
Yeah.
It was so big that even Kate Adie was sent to cover this story, and that was wow, I'm on a story with Kate Adie. Holy moly. And then I got rung up by London. They said, come up to London, old boy. Why don't you come and do a stint up here? Ended up in Northern Ireland, which I thought was absolutely fascinating,
yes.
gripping. And it was the time of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and there are kind of Molotov cocktails flying around. And, I learned a huge amount then. I remember we got caught in the middle of a protest where you've got, sort of IRA-backed protest on one side with petrol bombs, and there are guys with Molotov cocktails, and unionists on the other side who are just throwing sort of anything they could find. But it seemed to me there much more dangerous to go out try and escape via the IRA route, because they had
the flames,
yes. And they had guns and all the rest of it. And the cameraman who was said, no. Once they see we want to go out, they'll just stop and let us get out, because they understand the importance of getting the pictures out. Right. And I remember the story of one of my colleagues who got his car jacked, and there are the guys with the balaclavas and the Armalites, and they're saying, right, we want your car. And the guy from London says, oh, you can have my car. No worries, take the keys, here it is. Bit sticky getting it into first gear. And the IRA goes, well, don't you want to take your equipment out the back of the car? Because of course they understood
they want to get the story
out there.
I mean, you did it all, didn't you, actually?
What do you mean?
Well, you covered most of the major international stories during this next period of your career. You've mentioned Afghanistan. You were posted in Paris for a stint from 1999.
Yeah.
You kind of become one of the BBC's big faces now.
Yeah, I guess. And it was, it's a tremendous privilege to be out there as a foreign correspondent and trying to make sense of what was happening. And, my life was endlessly, when I was the Paris correspondent, being rung up and said, how quickly can you get to Calais?
Yeah.
And in London, they have a mental picture that the distance from Paris to Calais is the same as from London to Dover.
Yeah.
And it's about 50-60 miles to Dover, and it's about 175 miles to Calais. And yet you'd go racing up the motorway to try and get to Calais, and there'd be another load of illegal immigrants trying to get on back of a lorry, trying to escape from the Songat refugee camp, all sorts of nationalities. And you think, plus ça change. Here we are in 2024, and this problem of small boats, it has not changed that much.
And I think you were in Songat on September the 11th.
Yeah. And it was the lead story on the 1 o'clock news, because there had been a court case in Lille about closing the Songat refugee camp, which the authorities in London saw as just a kind of holding centre, before the illegal immigrants, they get watered and fed, and boom, they try and somehow get across the channel. And there was the announcement made that they were going to close the Songat refugee centre. It was the lead story. I was then on my way up to Songat to do the 6 o'clock news live from there, where I would be the lead story. And a producer in Paris rang and said, you better get off the road and have a look at what's happening. And that was then the first tower had come down. A plane tower had not come down, but a plane had flown in to the Twin Towers. And then whilst we were on our way to Calais, the second plane went in, and you thought, oh my God.
Everything changed.
And a dispatch rider was sent to my home in Paris to collect my passport, because I didn't know where I'd be going. at the end of that.
Because even though you were still the Paris correspondent, it was all sort of all hands to the pump, and you then end up in northern Afghanistan. You move, as you've mentioned, with the front line of the Northern Alliance as they fought the Taliban, and you went back to Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East. You're in Kuwait City during the invasion of Iraq. That's not politics, is it? I mean, I know ultimately it's politics, but there's not in the stuff that we've talked about thus far. Apart from the admiration for Kate Adie, there's not the intrepid foreign correspondent ambition kick, and yet there you were.
There I was. I think there was an element in which I'm not sure how much ambition I had to go to a war zone. I was quite interested. I don't know whether you'll understand this and whether this sounds pathetic. I was quite interested in how I would be in that situation.
Yes.
I was quite interested to know, here you are, John, are you going to crap your pants or are you going to be okay? It was sort of a bit of a mixture of the two, to be honest. And when I got out of Afghanistan, and it was a complicated bloody business getting out of the country, because we had to get out across a Russian demilitarized zone, which strictly speaking we weren't allowed to be in. We then go into Tajikistan. From Tajikistan we then fly to Dubai, because that was, you couldn't get, there's no London Tajikistan route, so you go to Dubai and we kind of decompress a bit there. And there were some people who were war junkies. I mean, it was the only time they ever felt alive was when there were shots being fired or explosions going off, and there was quite a bit of that in Afghanistan. And I just thought, thank God I'm out of there. And because there is a limit to how much you can say about the bigger political picture. And I sort of, look, you are part of a tiny bit of the mosaic of what is happening. I remember doing, I was there principally for the main evening news outlets, but you'd get roped into doing a live for the news channel or whatever, and they'd say, so John, you're in northern Afghanistan, what can you tell me about the situation in Jalalabad? And you say, absolutely sod all, frankly. No, nothing. And like, how am I meant to know? We didn't have the communications were absolutely awful. We were living, this city of Kunduz where the city of Kunduz was under siege, and that's what but we were in a city called Talakan, 100,000 people, not much smaller than Southampton, frankly. There was no electricity. There was no running water. It was, we had a kid who went down to the river each day to bring back 2 pails, to light a fire, to warm up the water so that you could have a pitcher of water to shave and wash. That was how we lived. And so it was pretty, so there was an element in which is, don't give me I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. This was the real kind of roughing it experience.
And you're glad that you did it, but you couldn't have done it forever.
No, and I didn't want to do it forever.
And in 2005, you're back in London presenting the politics show on BBC One, which was a plum gig.
Yeah, it was, and it was really nice to be asked to do.
And another pivot point in your career, perhaps, when you sort of become I don't want to use the word famous, but this would be when people start recognising you a bit more in the street and stuff like that.
Yeah, and
did you enjoy that side of it?
I did enjoy that side of it. I found it hard.
Yeah.
I mean, it was look, Andrew Marr, also of this parish now, he had the main gig, which was the Sunday morning gig, and he got the best interviews. And you were sort of, it felt slightly. I mean, I did my best to upset things as much as I could in terms of my own contacts and getting Blair on and getting Brown on and getting these leaders on who previously exclusively done the Andrew Marr show. So I tried to be a disruptor of all of that. And it was it was an interesting time. The end of Blair, but then the collapse of Brown, and the transition over to Cameron as Prime Minister.
Which makes, I presume, the 2014 invitation to take over from Mark Mardell in North America irresistible, or was it? I mean, did you give it long and hard thought? Did you speak to your wife and family about it, or did you just say, yes, when do I start?
It was one of those very classic BBC things where the head of 5 Live had said to me, wanted me to take over, I think, 5 Live Drive, and he said, go and talk to Fran Unsworth, who was then the head of news at the BBC. Go and talk to Fran Unsworth about it. And so I go to talk to Fran Unsworth about it and say, okay, Johnny sent me here to talk to you because you've got to convince me. She said, oh my God, you don't want to do that job. North America editor's job. We want you to become North America editor. I said, oh really? Yeah. I said, and will there be a board? Well, there'll have to be a board, but anyone serious will discourage them from applying. And so it ended up that I was given an interview for the North America editor job, where there was going to be one other applicant who then realised it was slightly a waste of time, dropped out, and I said, I really do have to fuck this interview up if I'm not going to get the job when I'm the only candidate being spoken to.
And lo and behold,
I did get it. And it was a dream. It really was a dream come true. I'd applied for it when Mark Modell got it, and I'd wanted it.
Yeah.
And it was just I just thought it would be a dream job, and it is a dream. It's an incredible privilege.
You had a very similar experience actually when they wanted you to apply for the political editor's job after Laura Kuenssberg prepared to step down. But you've spoken about that a lot, and you write about it in detail in the book, so we don't need to detain ourselves unduly with a repetition of that story. What we do need to do is look at where Strangeland comes from, because it comes from the realization when you arrived in America that a country that you thought you knew, you'd been to Washington lots of times, you'd travelled there a lot. I think you'd ridden a Harley down the West Coast, so you didn't learn your lesson as a 16-year-old about motorbikes to your mother's horror, I'm sure. But you're right that when you got there, you realised you didn't know America at all, and that obviously becomes exacerbated and magnified hugely by the success, the rise and the success of Donald Trump, who essentially, in the context of American politics, the starting gun was him claiming that Barack Obama hadn't been born in America, wasn't it? It was all the birtherism and the passport stuff. But what is unique to you, as we mentioned a couple of times, what makes your perspective unique is that you carry that sense home 8 years later and arrive in Britain as a country that you thought you knew, and begin to think that perhaps you didn't after all.
Yeah, and there were all sorts of aspects, just the way dialogue was conducted. I mean, a simple example. We used to think of politics and politicians as sort of hopeless, chaotic, couldn't organise a piss up in a brewery. You know, Theresa May delivering that speech where her voice is hoarse, where the letters are falling off the backdrop and someone hands her a P45. I mean, that was straight out of peak Britain.
Amanda Iannucci would have sent that back as implausible.
Neil Kinnock falling into the waves on Brighton Beach when he's trying to do a photo call with Glenys. You know, that is how we thought of politics. And suddenly we're now thinking that politics is all conspiracy and there are people plotting, made worse by the fact, whereas the conspiracy theories always played a big part in American politics. But it was suddenly people with power acting like they were the victims of conspiracy. And you saw that a bit with Johnson when he's talking about the kangaroo court, which we were talking about earlier. And Liz Truss, for God's sake, you know, here was this woman who comes to be Prime Minister saying, I believe in the markets and free market economics. She's brought down by free markets and free market economics, and then blames everyone else and says it was the establishment, the deep state, and parroting all this sort of... I mean, it was sub-Trumpian, the language that she used to describe what was her own self-immolation. And you just think, no, I'm sorry, this is weird. What is happening to this country? And there were other areas as well where we just went mad, thinking, you know, going down mad rabbit holes about what are they really going, what's happening with the royal family, why are they telling us this? Or there'll be a murder. And you saw what happened, and this is after I'd written the book, and you know, maybe if I have to write or I want to write a new chapter for a paperback edition, I'll talk about it. I mean, what happened in the riots? The riots got up by people who want to weaponise and use the social media to spread conspiracy and falsehood, and before you know it,
they're setting fire to hotels.
They're setting fire to hotels with immigrants in them and hoping that they burn to death.
I'll tell you what intrigues me is the idea of it having been there all along. It's just that checks and balances, or good chap theory of government, one of your chapters is entitled Good Chap, that the unwritten constitution on this side of the Atlantic, the written constitution on that side of the Atlantic, we may not have realised it, but they were actually processes of containment for what is a human impulse, what is always bubbling under the surface of humanity.
And anyone who thinks that the institutions that we have, look, you know, on your show every day you talk about, you know, a lot of the problems that we face in Britain, and we do the same on the podcast. But we also have a lot that is absolutely fantastic
Yeah.
in terms of free speech, the fact that we're able to do this without being arrested. We may get abuse, that's fine, but we aren't arrested for it. There are free and fair elections in this country. None of this stuff can be taken for granted. None of this stuff is immutable. Because we've had it in our lifetime, previous generations have not. And I think the idea that we can just, oh, well, the far right are on the rise, or the populist left are on the rise, and, simple answers to complex problems. No. I mean, life is kind of difficult and it's complex making these decisions, and we just need to have a reality check on some of these things. And I just think that coming back, I thought, my God, we're going down a route. Now, we're not as divided as America. We do not have the same cultural issues over...
Despite the best efforts of some politicians here.
But, like when Nigel Farage said, what are the police holding back from us after the murderers in Southport? And you think, well, the police are meant to... The police don't do investigations where they're telling you everything they're doing at once. And there is a process. And I thought that someone like him... He knows that the police have got to go about their work, and they're not just going to pander to the Daily Mail saying, "Well, was this a kind of racist attack or whatever?" Yeah. And I just think that people who know better, who try to weaponize this stuff to stir up dissent, it needs journalism to hold these people to account and hold their feet to the flames for what they're doing. Because I happen to believe that, you talked about both-sidism. On the one hand, some people would say it was wrong for Russia to invade Ukraine. On the other, what is the other hand? And I sometimes think that, on the other hand, when people are trying to stir up shit for the sake of it, because it will help their political careers to drive wedges between people, I think that's not a great place.
What changed then? What opened the door to this type of politics in this country?
I think that it is a mixture, and I think that the trouble with writing a book is you've got to have chapter headings. I mean, your book, The People Who Broke Britain or whatever, was brilliant in the sense that you could have delineation. Yeah. But I think if you're writing about some of these, I'm dealing in a lot of overlapping circles here.
Yeah, of course.
I'm dealing in the overlapping circle of the lack of respect for the kind of rules of political engagement, which
applies in countless different contexts.
Yeah. But then you've got conspiracy theory, and then you've got social media, and then you've got the media itself and polarization, and the worry that I have, frankly, I mean, we've spoken about the BBC, but I also worry about GB News seemingly being given a relatively free run to do what it likes to create a Fox style atmosphere, because you can be sure that there'll be some entrepreneur who thinks, well, if they've created a Fox News in Britain, why don't we have a left wing one as well? And then you stop getting news as information. You're getting news to be affirmed. You live in your bubble, and you'll just get the news that you want to hear and the viewpoints that you want to hear. And I just think that's bad for democracy. So I think it's kind of grown, and I think that we're not yet there yet. We are nothing like as bad as America. And if this book has kind of got anything, and let's not go there, but let us not be complacent about the risk.
Do you get frightened?
Yeah, I get frightened about. Yeah, I do. I think that I think it is frightening that. There is so much misinformation. I think it is frightening the way people are prepared to ride roughshod over sort of institutions that I have kind of vaguely respected. I get frightened that I think that some of the stuff. I mean, we talked about my Jewish background. I mean, October the 7th was hideous. I kind of thought, oh, God, I'm a very kind of agnostic, secular Jew. I don't go to synagogue. I don't keep a kosher home. I married out. My kids weren't brought up Jewish. I don't. But
that wouldn't matter to the SS, would it?
Yeah, exactly. And so you suddenly worry. But I equally think you mustn't catastrophize too readily. I think that Britain is still, for the most part, a tolerant country. And I thought, okay, let's go back to the riots, which I don't write about in the book, but which is kind of really interesting. What was the true face of Britain? Was it the vile people on the night who want to burn down a mosque and are throwing stones at the police when they're talking, people who also talk about the importance of law and order
And British values.
and British values? Or is it the people who the next day are clearing up and are taking food and repairing the wall and helping repair the windows of the mosque? And I just think that the mob are ugly and small, and the majority tends to be quite quiet. And I would like that majority to be a little noisier about the importance of some of the values of tolerance and understanding. And I don't think patriotism you can equate to wearing Union Jack socks or Union Jack cufflinks or saying, I like a full English breakfast, and when are they going to ban that? I think it's just ludicrous, and it's, performative jingoism.
But it's on the march. And to come full circle, in a way, we think it's that the mob is small, but these forces that are bubbling away under humanity all the time.
4 million people voted for reform.
Well, they're the same forces that prompted the exodus of people from Eastern Europe who ended up in the Oxford and St George's Club in Whitechapel.
Exactly. And I think that, so people fleeing persecution, it's easy to say we've got enough bloody foreigners in this country, we want to keep them out. But an awful lot of foreigners have built a lot of what makes Britain absolutely a fantastic country. And absolutely in America, you look at, what has been the great growth engine of the economy? It's the tech sector, it's Silicon Valley. They're nearly all foreigners. They're nearly all people who've come to America because America says, come in. We want the brilliance of these people in our country. And, I just think that there needs to be a more grown-up conversation about migration and its importance.
Strangeland by Jon Sopel is out now in hardback, although I suspect the paperback might have an extra chapter. Jon Sopel, thank you.
James, thank you very much.